Well, thank you all for coming, and especially thank you, Betty and Ken, for making this possible. So here's what I'm going to try to talk about. I'm going to eventually focus on the prospects that the Trump administration would be able to possibly do the impossible. What President Trump likes to call the big deal. Wouldn't it be nice, he said, if we were able to crack this nut that all previous administrations have failed? And I apologize to all of you who are skeptics. Somehow you caught me at the moment of optimism. So you will come out of this session either happier than when you came in, but certainly determined that I need to be institutionalized in some mental support place. Let me start with the broader context. In his campaign for the presidency, Donald Trump made 4 or 5 promises that are related to the Middle East. First of all, he talked about recalibrating America's relations with the region's states by giving preference to the issues of safety and security and stability over commitments to values that he values less, like human rights, civil rights, and so on. And this was actually even in his inaugural address. Secondly, his commitment to destroy ISIS. Third, he promised, remember, to tear up the nuclear agreement with Iran. Sometimes he even said, I think he even said on the first day, or the first week, or the first month. The fourth issue, which is a broader issue, but also related to the Middle East that he talked about, was to end what I think he called, or at least others called, free riding, by which he meant, or cheap riding, by which he meant wealthy countries that are recipients of America's defense guarantees and commitments, who don't pay their share or their fair share in the costs of guaranteeing their security. And he committed himself to make them pay their fair share. And finally, he committed himself to restore what he called America's broken relations with Israel, including, if you recall, to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, these are commitments that he made. But in addition to these commitments, he also expressed an aspiration. And as I said, the aspiration was, wouldn't it be great if a deal that evaded all of his predecessors to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict could be made. In fact, Trump expressed an even greater aspiration. He called it the bigger deal. The even bigger deal. And the even bigger deal would involve some of the key Arab countries, key Arab states, to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, to be serious, actually, it's quite ridiculous to try to talk about an administration 50 or 60 days after its inauguration. But so far, interestingly enough, the administration and President Trump personally has managed within 50 or 60 days already to walk back from most of these commitments. And don't laugh, because I think some of the walking back made a lot of sense. And so first of all, there is no real dramatic change in the U.S. strategy to defeat ISIS yet. There is some change in the sense that President Trump has authorized an increase in the number of soldiers on the ground, particularly in Syria. But the reality is that the American strategy to so-called degrade and defeat ISIS was set in place by the Obama administration. And so far, at least, there have been no dramatic changes in the strategy, again, except for some increased use of drones and some increase in the presence of American soldiers on the ground. It's not actually, especially in Syria, it's not actually crystal clear whether the primary task of the presence on the ground is to defeat ISIS or to prevent a violent confrontation between Turkey and the Kurds after ISIS is defeated, especially in Raqqa, in Syria. Because the problem with, and the reason why this is the case, and the reason why this whole war on ISIS has taken so long, is because of one very simple fact. And this is one of the few things that you might want to remember from this evening. ISIS is the #2 enemy of almost everybody in the Middle East. But it's the #1 enemy of almost no one in the Middle East. Okay? So the reason why all this is taking so long is because all the players have other worries. Okay? And the Turks, as much as they would like to see ISIS is defeated, their nightmare is not ISIS. Their nightmare is an independent Kurdish state. So their problem is, okay, if ISIS is defeated in Syria, who replaces ISIS? And if the boots on the ground are actually Kurdish boots on the ground, okay, that's the first step to the Turkish nightmare. And managing this problem that America has, which is an alliance management problem, is a problem that President Obama was heavily involved in, and now President Trump has inherited. So, but clearly there's no, yes, eventually ISIS is going to be defeated, and the dilemma will remain what comes after ISIS, because ISIS was not ISIS before that. It was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated, and it became ISIS. So now the question is, so how do you prevent ISIS from simply being reconfiguring in a different way? That's the dilemma we're facing. And as I said, there's no fundamental change in the strategy until now. So that's number one. Number two, the Trump administration did not tear down the nuclear agreement with Iran. Even if Prime Minister Netanyahu was hoping to reach an agreement with President Trump on how to repeal and not replace the agreement with Iran, he evidently failed because instead the Trump administration had evidently not done that. The very short-lived National Security Advisor, General Flynn, put Iran on notice and had the entire world media trying to figure out what on notice means. And the administration and the president personally promised the Saudis only that the United States will demand that Iran will strictly comply with the agreement that was signed. That actually strengthens the agreement. It actually means the United States is determined to see this agreement succeed rather than tear and repeal it. So that's number two. Number three, all the talk about doing something about the free riders in the region, especially the Saudis and the small Gulf cooperation states that are enjoying America's security guarantees? Well, so far at least, there is no evidence, zero evidence, that in all the important conversations that did take place over the last 40 days, the first 40 or 50 days with Saudi leaders, including the Deputy Crown Prince, who is also the Minister of Defense and is said to be the strongest person in Saudi Arabia today, there is no evidence that President Trump or any of his advisors have actually raised this issue and demanded that the Saudis and what I sometimes call the Gulfies contribute more to their defense, or what President Trump talks about in the campaign, reimburse America's the costs for the United States. On relations with Israel, I would say, first of all, we have to remember that contrary to what you may have heard, U.S. Israeli defense and intelligence cooperation have never been as close as they have been during the 8 years of the Obama administration. What Obama has miserably failed is to convey the emotional feeling of his commitment to Israel and his attachment. And that's the difference. Now, in reality, of course, President Trump came in and he managed to do what President Obama failed to do, which is to convey to Israelis and to convey to members of the American Jewish community that he really emotionally is committed to Israel and that he has an emotional attachment to Israel. Period. That's the difference. In reality, for now, except for that, nothing has changed. The embassy is not going to Jerusalem. The new ambassador has an apartment in Jerusalem, but the embassy is not moving anytime soon. The president discovered that, I quote, it's complicated. And on Trump, and on the key issue that was the center of one of the two centers to the tension between Netanyahu and Obama, the other one being Iran, which is to say settlement construction, especially in the West Bank. Well, President Trump publicly, in the press conference after his first meeting as president with Netanyahu, said, can you wait just a little bit about further construction in the West Bank? He said, just a little bit, wait a little bit. And since then, there have been extensive negotiations or talks between Netanyahu and his people and President and the White House, especially with Jason Greenblatt, the lawyer from New York, who is entrusted now by the president to see what can be done. I'll get to that in a few minutes. But the same issue that was in contention between Obama and Netanyahu is now a problem for Netanyahu. The same issue that occupied Secretary Kerry's attention is back. So what we see is there have been dramatic suggestions, proposals, commitments, promises. So far, there's been relatively little change. Now, why has there been relatively little change? And I say this actually in a positive way. First of all, the Middle East realities have a way, an annoying way of imposing themselves. You know, you're dealing with the Middle East, there is a limit to how much you can talk about alternative facts. The facts are facts, and you have to deal with them, and some of them are extremely unpleasant, but they have a way of imposing themselves and of reminding you that they're there, they exist. So that's first. Secondly, I give credit to some of the Middle East leaders who identified the problem and volunteered to provide President Trump with tutorials about the Middle East reality. Not just the Saudis, but the King of Jordan actually traveled to Washington, D.C. It was actually an unusual trip. He actually came to Washington, D.C. without an invitation. He actually cornered the president in a prayer breakfast. The King of Jordan. But then that led to a meeting with the president and his national security advisors. And as you can use your wild imagination and imagine that what the president heard from King Abdullah was not exactly encouraging as far as the consequences or the possible consequences of moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. So leaders in the region have not been silent about helping the president understand what the realities of the region are. And the third reason is that President Trump created and I'm serious, a superb foreign and defense policy team. Yes, there was this glitch with General Flynn. I actually predicted almost immediately that he's not going to last, but frankly, I didn't think. When I said I don't think he's going to last, I thought he isn't going to last more than a year. So I was off by 11 months. But the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson, the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, the CIA Director, Mike Pompeo, all of these people are very experienced in the Middle East, in the ways of the Middle East. Some of them are experienced because they were on the ground in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you can imagine, the head of ExxonMobil talked to almost every leader, especially in the Gulf during his years. And so this is a group of people that are highly professional, not ideological. They live in realities, not alternative facts. So one reason why you see this walking back from commitments that could not be implemented is because the president actually built a remarkably high-level group to deal with the policies related to the Middle East and to explain to him, and if not to him, at least to the vice president, what the realities on the ground are. So, as the broader background of the Trump administration and the Middle East after the first 50 or 60 days, what about President Trump's professed desire to make the impossible deal to end the Arab-Israeli conflict? And the reason I suspect that some of you are going to send me to some kind of therapy after this meeting is that it will surprise you that against most of the expert opinion, quote unquote, if you read the pages of the op-ed articles of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and especially the more professional journals like Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs and so on and so forth, I actually think that President Trump has a chance. Now, why does he have a chance? There are three reasons. The first is that President Trump, that is not going to come as a shocking news to you, represents something very, very different from anything we've seen in the White House. And I think that actually his instinct that, so first of all, there's a president who comes in, and everything about him is radically different from everything that we've seen in the past, whether it was Republicans or Democrats. And I believe that actually his instincts are correct, that something very different must be tried, must be attempted. Because for the past 24 years, over three different administrations, the Clinton administration that was in when the Oslo Accords were signed, the 8 years of George W. Bush, and the 8 years of President Obama. more or less with some variation, the same approach was attempted. And all this, what is called the playbook failed. The reality is the conflict has not been ended. So first of all, the president comes with a very different approach. He's radically different. That's actually not a bad idea, because the not different has been tried. So that's number one. Number two, as you will see later, my argument would be that while the president's impatience and inattention to detail is a big problem in areas, certain areas, in this area, it can turn out to be a great asset. And I'll explain to you in a minute why. And third, his skills in marketing are also going to serve him well, because, and they actually prove to be the ultimate asset that he has. Now, why is this the case? Why are these three characteristics, which is to say, do something very different. Number two, demonstrate your impatience and inattention to detail, and your skill in marketing, why are they important? To appreciate them, I would say the following, which is to say, we have to explore why we haven't reached a deal until now. Only if we understand why, over these last 24 years, the efforts to resolve the conflicts have failed, maybe, just maybe, we'll understand why these particular assets can be important. So why have the efforts failed? Beyond the obvious. Okay, the obvious is the gap between the parties' position is very wide. That goes without saying. But what are the other reasons why the parties have failed, and why are President Trump's characteristics actually may prove to be an asset? What are the realities? And there are a few realities here. The first is the problem has never been, at least not in the last 15 years, the problem has not been a lack of creativity or an imagination that resulted in the inability to find imaginative solutions to the most important issues that divided the parties, those issues that those of us who are obsessed with this Arab-Israeli conflict call the permanent status issues. Permanent status issues meaning border demarcation in Jerusalem and the refugees and so on and so forth, and security. Rather than the fundamental problem has been the parties leaders couldn't figure out how to sell an agreement, given the fact that it was clear that an agreement is going to require huge concessions. As Bernie Sanders would say, huge concessions on both sides, okay? And the problem is not that Netanyahu or Abbas didn't want a deal. It's that the only deal that they thought is possible, they couldn't figure out how they can sell it domestically. So that's the first reality. The second, now this is the second thing you need to take home. The second reality is that the problem has never been in the details of the agreement or the details of the deal. Now why? And this is what you have to take home. The Arab-Israeli conflict violates the golden rule that the devil is in the details. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, the devil is not in the details. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, the devil is in the principles. The details are bridgeable. You just put a team of Israelis and a team of Palestinians, and believe me, I've been a member of these teams. You just put them somewhere, hopefully some place that's kind of beautiful, some Italian villa, and you give them 2 weeks, and they'll come up with formulas to solve these problems. Okay, the problem is not in the details of the agreement, but in the principles. And there are two issues that demonstrate this more than anything else. Take the issue of refugees. People say the Arab refugees issue, the Palestinian refugees issue is the most difficult issue in the conflict. The problem is not the details of the agreement. There are many blueprints. There are briefing books that thick on how to solve the refugees problem, which is to say where they can be resettled, what kind of compensation those that decide to settle somewhere else, how can the host governments be compensated. All the details have been worked by many, many Israeli and Palestinian and Arab experts. The problem is what to do with the principle, the symbol called the Palestinian right of return. Okay? That is where the problem is. Okay? And no Israeli government that is committed to Israel's future as a Jewish state can accept the right of return. And so far, no Palestinian leadership could abandon the right of return. Okay? So it's the principle that's the problem, and not the details. And the same applies to Jerusalem. The problem is not how to find a formula to share control over Jerusalem. Again, there are blueprints. People have sat with this issue and have suggested many, many creative and imaginative solutions to how to share control. That's not the problem. The problem is what do you do with the issue of the sovereignty over the Holy Basin? Who is going to be sovereign over the Holy Basin? God? Maybe. Okay. There are proposals, but this is where the problem is, okay? And this is where what has so far, in my view, crippled. So the issue is not the details. The devil is not in the details. The devil is in these principles. In principles that are fundamental, basic to the narratives of both sides that they failed to bridge until now. And the third, as I said, problem is that the leaders who couldn't figure out ever how to sell the agreement, and believe me, I've been involved in exercises that focused only on the marketing issue myself. When leaders discover that they can't sell a deal domestically, they never rejected the deal. They found an ability to change the conversation. They invented distractions. For example, they were willing to engage each other and the US in endless conversations about the conditions for negotiations. There are reports that came out in the last few weeks about the most recent or last episode in the Obama administration's efforts, led of course by Secretary Kerry. The last problem was, of course, the problems weren't resolved, so all of a sudden there was a conversation about how to extend the negotiations by 60 days. And the participants on the Israeli and Palestinian side have now published their view on these negotiations. These people have been so embedded in these negotiations that they don't even understand how ridiculous the whole thing is. You know, how the fact that the Secretary of State of the only remaining superpower was willing to engage in these intricate talks about what concessions Israel would be willing to make in order for the Palestinians to agree to extend the negotiations by 60 days. It's almost that you had to remind the Secretary of State that in fact he is the Secretary of State of the only remaining superpower. But he allowed himself to be sucked into something that he didn't initiate. The parties initiated it. But why did they initiate it? Because if they could reach a deal, they would have reached a deal. But they didn't want to say no, so they engaged each other in endless conversations about the conditions for negotiations. The fourth problem plagued all the negotiations. is something that I think lawyers who would negotiate big deals would recognize immediately the pluses and minuses of what I'm going to talk about. All these negotiations since Oslo in the last 24 years, again, across 3 administrations, Republicans, Democrats, Israeli prime ministers, different Israeli prime ministers, 2 Palestinian presidents, all of them were based on a principle. It actually was the only principle that the parties did agree to. And it was a deadly principle, in my view. Okay? And the principle is nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. Okay? Now, there's a big rationale. You can explain why and what are the advantages of having this principle. But what it means is 2 things. Number 1 is that if you say again and again and again, and if you base all the conversations and all the negotiations on the principle that nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon, it means 2 things. Number 1, that the whole process is hostage to the most difficult issue. Okay? Because you can achieve a lot of breakthroughs, and by the way, breakthroughs were achieved in negotiations. But all these breakthroughs were taken back because in the end, they didn't result in anything because if the most difficult issues, such as, for example, the issue of the right of return or the sovereignty over the Holy Basin, if you didn't reach an agreement on these 2 issues, you didn't reach an agreement. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, contrast it with the opposite principle. In other words, what is the opposite of nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon? The opposite is everything that you agree on, implement. Okay. Now, if the opposite principle was adopted, and I'm not telling you that there aren't problems there, then at least the populations on both sides would have seen some change, positive change in their eyes. Okay? But the reality is that Israelis and Palestinians have seen no change in the last 24 years. So the problem is not whether the Israeli or the Palestinian public is rejectionist or pro-peace or right or left. The problem is not that the right wing has taken over Israeli politics or Palestinian politics. The problem is that pessimism has overtaken the public. And why? It's natural. Why is it? The unnatural is to be hopelessly optimistic, right, in these kind of circumstances. Pessimism, a pessimistic reaction, is natural. It's the natural reaction in a situation in which people have not seen any change in these 24 years. And my view is that the main reason why people have not seen any change is that nothing was implemented. None of the understandings that were reached over these years was implemented because the whole process was held hostage to this principle. Now, the 5th problem is that all these negotiations over the last 24 years were primarily bilateral negotiations, Israeli-Palestinian, with varying degree of American involvement, which is to say, they were not the bigger deal that President Trump is talking about. Okay? Now, this is a big problem. And why is it a big problem? Because, in my view, there never was a bilateral solution to the bilateral Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why was there never a bilateral solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Because there are key issues that you cannot address without the participation of some key Arab countries. Okay, number 1, refugees. There are Palestinian refugees all over the region. Now, if you don't have Arab leaders buying into finding together a solution to the refugees issue, there is no solution to the refugees issue. And you cannot tell the Lebanese, you should integrate 150,000 refugees in Lebanon. You have to get their consent. You have to get some consent from the Jordanians about what to do with their very large minority, if not Palestinian majority, in Jordan. That's number one. Number two, there was never a Palestinian-Israeli solution to the Jerusalem issue. Why? When the last time there was a serious bilateral discussion on Jerusalem in Camp David, the reaction of Arab leaders that were seen as pro-peace, like President Mubarak and others, said to the Palestinians, excuse me, what right do you have to negotiate Jerusalem with the Israelis? Jerusalem is not a Palestinian issue. Jerusalem is a Muslim issue. Jerusalem is an Arab issue. Okay? And the reality is that Israel recognized in the peace treaty with Jordan that Jordan has a say in Jerusalem. The Saudis obviously see a connection between their holy shrines and Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And Morocco, by the way, remember there's a country in North Africa, beautiful by the way, called Morocco? Morocco happens to hold the Jerusalem portfolio for the Arab League and for the Conference of Muslim States. They hold the Jerusalem portfolio. They are in charge of the Muslim world's interests in Jerusalem. So you've got Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, all of them have interests in Jerusalem. So that's number two. Number three, security. There is no Palestinian solution to the Israeli security concerns. Okay? You have to have the involvement of key Arab countries for any serious solution to the security issue. Okay, now, and here's my last point. Paradoxically, as I said, I promised you, these realities don't mean, you think they might mean, that a solution is beyond reach. What I think is the case is that a deal is reachable, but it's only reachable if the traditional playbook that has guided these efforts in the last 24 years is set aside. I would say that playbook that I described, that playbook has to be repealed and replaced. What should it be repealed and replaced by? Since I don't want to compete with things that are entities beyond my pay grade, I'm not going to talk about the 10 Commandments. I'm only going to talk about 8 Commandments. So here's my 8 Commandments. Number 1, President Trump should avoid all the experts' calls for meticulous preparatory work. Trust me, there is nothing that is unknown about this conflict. Okay? That still needs to be studied, that requires more homework. Okay? So these calls for more preparations, and believe me, the administration will hear that from experts, and especially from the Palestinians, are merely efforts to suggest ways of avoiding the difficult decisions. In this case, I would say, if this president is uncomfortable with meticulous preparations, that may turn out to be an advantage. Secondly, I think President Trump should invite the parties to the negotiation table, whether it's in Camp David or Washington, D.C. or West Palm Beach, and invite them to negotiations and refuse to be engaged in any discussion with any of the two parties on conditions for negotiations. The president has to tell the parties, these negotiations are taking place. You either show up or you don't. And if not, he'll make sure that the world will know who didn't show up by using the most updated, sophisticated weapon of mass destruction called the tweet. Third, I think the president should refuse to engage in any conversation about interim arrangements. He should follow his instincts. to try for what he called the bigger deal. Fourth, I've already hinted at that, the president should avoid any effort to drown him in endless details. Trust me, they will try to drown him in endless details. He should remember what I told you, that the devil is not in the details, that the devil is in the principles. And this what seems to be commonly commented as a disadvantage, his inattention to detail, his impatience with detail, now famous, I think can be a real advantage. He can credibly say, I am not going to engage in these minute details. Okay? Here are the big problems, here's the big solution. Fifth, it will not come to you as a surprise that I think that the first thing he has to repeal and replace, now that he's not going to repeal and replace the agreement with Iran, he's going to repeal and replace the principle that nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. The sixth commandment is to recruit the Israeli defense community to support the process. And the reason this is the key is that from the point of view of the Israeli center, the Israeli population, and it's the 50% that is in the center that will determine on the Israeli side where this goes, they have to be reassured that the deal will not jeopardize their personal safety and security. This is why the defense community, the Israeli defense community, is the key. The Obama administration, by the way, although it failed on the Israeli-Palestinian front, it dealt masterfully with this issue in the context of the agreement with Iran. It had the American defense community engage the Israeli defense community. Of course, this was based on the fact that during those 8 years, the defense and intelligence cooperation between the two countries reached, as I said, levels that we've never seen before. We are in a different era than, if some of you remember, the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s. The members of the Joint Chiefs and the members of the General Staff in Israel, of the Israeli Defense Forces General Staff, know each other on first-name basis. The relationship is very close and very intimate. So the key here is to engage the Israeli defense community in a conversation about how to implement an agreement that will not jeopardize Israel's security and safety. Seventh, Trump should follow his instincts and go for the bigger deal for the reasons that I mentioned, because the Palestinians are too weak to provide the Israelis with what the Israelis need, which is security and safety. There is no agreement that would entail Israeli concessions, the minimal concessions that are required for a Palestinian state to be established, without the security issues associated with that addressed by a combination of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and especially the Jordanian involvement. And finally, President Trump is in an excellent position to reject any argument by either side that says, we don't know how to sell this agreement. We can't sell this agreement. Well, if President Trump doesn't know how to sell an agreement, then I have to retire to teach him this wonderful place called Tucson, Arizona. Because if he can't sell a deal, and if he can't credibly tell them, I'll tell you how to sell the deal. Okay? You can sell the deal. Don't tell me you can't sell the deal. This deal, every deal, is sellable. So my view is, if the president follows these 8 commandments, I think there's actually a shot. I know that I'm against almost all expert opinion, but my approach to these issues, my metaphor is an entrepreneur in a very, very, very bad economy. Okay? So the Middle East is the equivalent of a very, 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 very bad economy. But the entrepreneur, first of all, his instincts are to look for the tiniest cracks. And secondly, the entrepreneur rarely has the luxury of saying, okay, the economy is bad, I'll come back in 20 years. That's not what entrepreneurs do. So, like an entrepreneur in a very, very, very bad economy, you see what you have. I'm a student of Shimon Peres, the late president of Israel, who said, we all die in the end. And he said, I prefer to die as an optimist than to die as a pessimist. Thank you.